I guess the first thing to say about Roe is that the writing was always on the wall for Roe, right? It has always seemed like a dubious judicial decision and just the wrong way to enshrine abortion rights at the federal level. And the fact that we've been relying on it for 50 years has been a failure of governance, right? The Democrats knew how precarious Roe was, and yet they completely failed to pass legislation, much less an amendment to the Constitution, to properly guarantee this right for women. Right? So there's a lot of blame to go around, and the Democrats share in that blame. That said, I think repealing Roe is going to be unambiguously bad for women, in particular poor women in red states. And it'll be bad for the red states, too. I think the spectacle of having desperate women prosecuted as murderers for going out of state to terminate a pregnancy or taking illegal medication at home, this will be bad for business. I think you'll find that corporations don't much like being associated with a real-life version of The Handmaid's Tale. But again, this will only hurt red states. But I don't think the problem necessarily stops here. Right? I do think there's a larger concern about creeping theocracy. Now let's call this for what it is, right? What happened here? The unjustified and unjustifiable religious beliefs of Catholics on the Supreme Court have delivered this change in our society. This is religion, pure and simple. There is simply no valid ethical argument that privileges the interests of a single fertilized ovum over those of a woman whose life is going to be completely deranged by being forced to have a child. Okay? It's not just that pro-life absolutists have bad arguments. They have no arguments for banning abortion at the earliest stages. But then pro-choice absolutists are also extremists. Anyone who would argue for abortion as an absolute right of a woman at every stage of pregnancy, as though terminating a fetus in the third trimester had no ethical implications beyond a woman's bodily autonomy, such people are just not making contact with the real ethical terrain here. So our political debate about abortion seems pretty confused, and it ignores the very sensible intuitions that most people have on this topic. I mean, most people recognize that a clump of cells is not a person, while a 30-week-old fetus is so close to being a bouncing baby that it is a person. The real problem here is to figure out where that change happens, and therefore where it becomes ethically complicated to terminate a pregnancy. The most important question for me is, at what point in development can a fetus conceivably suffer? That's not the only consideration, but I think it's the main one. And here it's reasonable to think that sensory connections to the cortex are the relevant threshold. We can be even more conservative than that and draw the line somewhere earlier, but it's not an accident that most people think that the first trimester and the third trimester are very different, ethically speaking. And the difference is in the presence or absence of the nervous system structures that could conceivably produce suffering. Terminating a pregnancy at 10 weeks is just different than terminating one at 30 weeks. Given what we know about developmental neuroscience, I would say that the first should be at the total discretion of the mother, and the second should require very serious justification, like saving the mother's life, or saving the child from some utterly horrific suffering, should it be born. And obviously, emergency late-term abortions should and do include anesthesia. At a certain stage in pregnancy, you have to treat a fetus as a being who can suffer. But over 90% of abortions happen in the first trimester. And given what we know, that should be a legal practice available to all women, especially given what we know about the effects on a society that outlaws that practice. Ultimately, there's a lot of ethical work still ahead of us to understand human development in a fine-grained way, and to specify exactly where a fetus, even a specific fetus, becomes a person to which we want to ascribe independent interests. But most people know that the extremes are very different. 10 weeks and 30 weeks, say. And where we draw the line should be somewhere in the middle of that range. And yet our political discourse tends not to reflect this. But the fact that we appear to be moving into a situation where abortion at every stage will be illegal in half the country, that is clearly a step backwards, politically and ethically. And we have Iron Age religion to thank for it.